Number 12, Andrew Flair says, is typology only about Jesus? If so, how do we explain the type or antitype in 1 Peter 3:21? If not, how do we tell true/false types when no new theology can run afoul of denominational disagreement? Let's try and tackle this one here. Let's first just look at your example, and then we'll try to see how it works with your question here. 1 Peter 3:21, which I think is on baptism. Yeah. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who's gone into heaven, is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. Now, I don't know if I've ever made the rule that typology always has to be about Jesus. I'm sure someone has that rule. I don't have that rule in my head, that typology always has to be about Jesus. It certainly seems like typology in the Old Testament is totally preoccupied with Jesus. That does seem to be the case. And for anybody who doesn't follow this yet, by typology, that phrase typology, what we mean is the Old Testament does these things that are like Easter eggs, right? These like hidden things that represent Jesus, that later on when the New Testament comes, you go, oh, look at the Easter eggs all through the Old Testament that represent Jesus. Moses hits the rock. It's like Jesus, he was broken for my salvation. You know, the baptism is kind of like the flood. You know, they go through the judgment, but then they make it all the way out because they're safe in the boat, right? By the way, the boat here would be Jesus. And so I do think this type is Jesus. The type and the antitype. The type is the boat, right? They were saved through water, the boat going through the water. There's the people, the boat, and the water, if you read verses 20 and 21. And that is like me and you, we're the people. The boat is like Jesus. The water is like baptism. Jesus dies and rises again, kind of like the boat goes into the water and comes out. I ride the coattails of Jesus through death and into life because he was the one who could survive the flood, who could make it through death to life. Whereas I was the one, if it was without the boat, I would just drown. I would just suffer the judgment of my own sins and die. But he could pay the penalty and survive, resurrect. So I think that this is about Jesus, your example. So yeah, I do think typology is preoccupied with Jesus, that's for sure. Does that mean every type in the Old Testament has to be about Jesus specifically? I wouldn't argue for that. I'm open to others. But man, my series, Jesus in the Old Testament, we go through dozens upon dozens upon dozens, and they're just about Jesus so often that's definitely the preoccupation. Okay, so here's your follow-up question. You said, if typology is not always about Jesus, right, then how do we tell what's a true or false type when no new theology can run afoul of denominational disagreement? I'm not entirely sure how you mean that, Andrew. And again, this is an issue where it's just there's a limit to how many letters you can put in the YouTube comment, but on a live chat. But I do have a rule that no new theology should come from our typology. That is a rule I think is absolutely important. I think it's very valuable. I think that what we do is we establish our theology first through scriptures that demonstrate the theology clearly. Then you can look at typology and see how the Easter eggs have been laid in the Old Testament for those things. Jesus' death and resurrection and the direct teaching about his identity establishes those things. The typology of Christ is connected to that. I'm safe as a Christian when I stick to the clear teachings of Scripture reinforced by typology about those things. That's a safe place to be. One of the rules I have about typology is that no new theology. So when you say the issue of denominational disagreements, like let's say on mode of baptism or something like that, I just would never use typology to establish that my denomination is correct on this issue or that issue. I would use clear teachings of Scripture. What I'm saying is, on these secondary issues, the denominational disagreements, I don't think typology should be brought into it. I think clear teaching of Scripture should be brought in, and we shouldn't argue from typology to our practices. This is the flaw of the Marian dogmas of the Catholic Church. When it comes to the Bible, they can't find the stuff about Mary in the Bible in any clear fashion. And I mean, yeah, she was blessed, and Mary's blessed, right? Mary is blessed among women, right? Here's a Protestant saying it, as we have been for many years. um, but to say that Mary like was born without original sin, to say that Mary didn't in some cases they say she didn't die, but the dogma is that she was taken up into heaven. It was the assumption of Mary. Like those types of things, no, that's nowhere in Scripture. It's not really even in the early church in the very beginning. So what they do is they go to typology to prove this theology. This to me is interesting because once you've established Jesus, who the Old Testament is obsessed about, not just in typology, but in direct prophecy in 100 ways, right? Like, it's not like we just see Jesus in typology. That's just like the icing on the cake. But when you go to typology to prove Mariology, for example, what you're doing is you're skipping over the entire process of proving a doctrine is true, and now you're just looking for ways to find analogies for it. And the typology that they use tends to be very poorly constructed. It's self-contradictory. It only has like 2 elements of connection instead of like 7, or even just consistent elements of connection. Anyway, I've probably gone too long in that question. I hope that somewhere in all of my ramblings, Andrew, you found something helpful.